You're listening to The Globalists, first broadcast on the 30th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. This is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, former US President and Nobel Peace Prize winner Jimmy Carter has died at 100 years old. We'll look back at his life. Then...
And the bloody war in Ukraine? That's none of Croatia's business, and it will not be any of Croatia's business, and Croatian soldiers will not go there.
In Croatia, the incumbent Zoran Milanovic has taken an overwhelming victory in the first round of the presidential election, perhaps because of his attitude to the conflict. But he'll still face a runoff in a fortnight after falling just short of the 50% mark for an overall win. Slovakia is in the spotlight as an energy row brews with Ukraine, and the Kremlin suggests Bratislava might be a good peace broker. We'll have a look through the front pages, plus...
Jean-Michel Basquiat first traveled to Switzerland in 1982 for his first European exhibition in Zurich.
We'll find out what lies in store for art lovers in Europe in 2025. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Israeli forces carrying out a weeks-long offensive in northern Gaza ordered any residents remaining in Beit Hanun to leave the town yesterday for their own safety. Mikhail Kavalashvili, a hardline critic of the West, was sworn in as president of Georgia on Sunday amid a political crisis after the government froze European Union application talks in a move that sparked major protests. And US billionaire Elon Musk drew criticism from German politicians, from the government and opposition on Sunday for an opinion piece he wrote backing the right-wing Alternative for Germany, which they deemed intrusive outside influence. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. But first, former US President Jimmy Carter has died, aged 100. The 39th President of the United States lived longer than any president in history, serving one turbulent term in the White House before building a reputation as a global humanitarian and champion of democracy. Here's Monocle's Andrew Muller taking a look back at his life.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
the
office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability,
Jimmy Carter could not have won any other presidential election in US history, and indeed he didn't. He became the 39th President of the United States in 1976, running against the profoundly uninspiring figure of Gerald Ford, the only man in American history to have served as Vice President and President without ever being elected to either office, and a Republican Party exhausted and tarnished by the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. He lost office 4 years later, thrashed 44 states to 6 by Ronald Reagan.
The presidency. Reagan is our projected winner. Ronald Wilson Reagan of California, a sports announcer, a film actor.
The rest of Carter's life would be spent trying to persuade America, the world, and perhaps himself that this judgment of his presidency had been unfair. James Earl Carter Jr. was born to a farming family in Plains, Georgia on October 1st, 1924. After graduating from university, he served for 7 years in the US Navy, including a stint as an officer aboard a submarine. Back home in Georgia, after leaving the armed forces, he won election to the state senate in 1962. Throughout his career, Carter perceived no conflict between his conservative Baptist background and a passion for civil rights. Indeed, he believed them parts of one whole. He was a staunch pro-Kennedy Democrat, which wasn't always an easy thing to be in the American South of the 1960s. However, in a symbolic shift in 1970, Carter replaced as Georgia's governor Lester Maddox, an old-school race-baiting fire-breather.
Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly, that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Carter positioned himself as the embodiment of the so-called New South, propounding a folksy liberalism that would later be sold more cunningly and more successfully by a young Arkansas lawyer named Bill Clinton. Carter convincingly won the 1976 Democratic nomination by seeing off two other governors who represented his party's eccentric extremes, Jerry Moonbeam Brown of California and George Segregation Forever Wallace of Alabama.
Fellow citizens, I thank you for the nomination you've offered me.
Carter's brief presidency was not without domestic accomplishment. The establishment of a Department of Education, a shoring up of Social Security, a reduction in unemployment. But the purse-lipped homespun piety that he brought to Washington from planes was never far from the surface. In 1979, with the country beleaguered by an energy crisis, he gave a bizarre sermon, the so-called National Malaise speech, in which he admonished Americans for being self-indulgent and materialistic. He might not have been wrong, but he was assuredly unwise to say so.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
It was abroad that Carter really floundered, and worse, was seen to flounder by an American people who'd grown used to the idea that they were an awesome, undefiable superpower. Carter's presidency became defined by events in Tehran in 1979, when 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days by zealous students under the command of radical cleric Ayatollah Khomeini.
The lives of our people in Iran are at stake. I must emphasize the gravity of the situation.
Though rescue attempts were planned and one attempted, with tragic results, Carter, and America with him, was made to look impotent and indecisive. As a crowning insult, the hostages were released literally as Carter's successor, the indefatigably optimistic, straight-shooting matinee idol Ronald Reagan, was taking the oath of office.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute...
Carter indisputably accomplished more once out of office than in it. He assumed the role of freelance diplomat, travelling extensively between crisis-plagued regions, eventually winning the 2002 Nobel Prize for Peace in recognition of his efforts in conflict resolution, although few of the conflicts with which he concerned himself, notably Israel versus Palestine, are resolved.
It is with a deep sense of gratitude that I accept this prize. I'm grateful to my wife, Rosalind, to my colleagues at the Carter Center, and to many others who continue to seek an end to violence and suffering throughout the world.
His greatest legacy may be the work of his NGO, the Carter Center, in disease control. When the Carter Center began tackling the ghastly parasite guinea worm in Africa and Asia in 1986, it affected 3.5 million people. In 2014, 126 cases were reported worldwide. That astonishing accomplishment in itself would amount to a laudable legacy.
No poor, rural, weak, or black person should ever have to bear the additional burden of being deprived of the opportunity of an education, a job, or simple justice.
On balance, Jimmy Carter deserves better from posterity than being remembered principally for having spent 4 years of a long and productive life doing a job for which he was spectacularly ill-suited.
Andrew Muller there. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Yesterday, Croatians voted in the country's third poll this year. There was a snap parliamentary election in April, the European Parliament ballot in June, and yesterday citizens turned out once more to choose a president. But the 3.8 million eligible voters of this NATO and EU member country now have yet another election ahead of them, as the incumbent president Zoran Milanovic narrowly missed out on an all-out victory after falling just short of the 50% mark for an overall win. Well, I'm joined now by Nina Dos Santos, who's an international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor, and Guy Delaunay, Monocle's Balkans correspondent. Good morning to you both, and thank you for coming on. I know it's been a long night. Guy, was this result a surprise?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. Not in terms of Zoran Milanovic being the leading candidate in the election. That had been entirely predicted, and he's long been the most popular politician in Croatia. But in terms of the margin of victory and how close he came to an overall win in the first round, yes, that was a surprise, because in the polls in the run-up to the election, he was on 39%, according to the last poll that was taken. He got slightly more than 49%, and in fact the exit polls said he was going to beat that 50% mark and win in the first round, which would have been truly astonishing. Nobody's done that since Franjo Tudjman in the 1990s, and Franjo Tudjman was the father of Croatian independence. There's never been another figure like him in Croatian politics. So Mr. Milanovic there was doing something if not quite unprecedented, then very nearly, and it's quite something, and it's a really humiliating result for the governing HDZ party of Prime Minister Andrej Plenković.
Nina, Croatia joined the EU in 2012, and you met Milanovic then. I wonder if you can tell us about his trajectory since that time.
Well, he's really changed. I remember doing a half-hour documentary and interview with him in Zagreb back in, I think it was 2013. So again, as you pointed out, Croatia joining the EU at this time, and it was a much-fated decision, and one that was hugely supported by Zoran Milanovic himself. And he appeared to be extremely enthusiastic about the prospect of Croatia's future inside the EU, but lots of Croatian political advisors, business people will tell you that since then, in the decade that has passed, he has changed his political colours somewhat and begun to become something of a bête noire of the EU. If you listen to some of the insults that he and Plenković have talked about in the past, he's accused the current ruling Prime Minister Plenković of being Ursula von der Leyen's robot-controlled errand boy. On the other hand, his rival has said that he's a fire-spewing badger. One of them has called the other one a cancer on Croatian politics, quote unquote. So it has become quite unpleasant in terms of sort of the fiery rhetoric, and that has earned him the moniker, the Trump of Europe. And normally, at the time I went to go and interview him, he was Prime Minister. Now, of course, he's President and may well get another term in office. You'd have thought that that would be more a ceremonial role in countries like this, but in places like Croatia, also in places like France, a presidency, in many cases, obviously has jurisdiction over the military, and this is where his role is quite important with regards to the future of Ukraine and whether or not the EU and NATO, because Croatia is a key member of those organisations, continues to be behind defending Ukraine.
I particularly like fire-spewing badger. Guy, was this a fight for the soul of Croatia? Why has the country turned away from a Western-facing future under Dragan Primorac? What's the appeal of Milanovic?
Well, I don't think it's true that they've turned away from an EU-facing future, and I don't think it's true that Zoran Milanovic has turned away from the EU either. What he's doing is he's criticising aspects of the EU which are fairly obvious to anybody in Croatia, that it isn't all fairies and flowers when it comes to the European Union, and there's been niggles and squiggles along the way, most recently when Croatia joined the Eurozone, but then saw inflation massively increase rather predictably as a result, or when it joined Schengen only for about 5 minutes later, Slovenia to close its border, or not exactly close its border, but impose more stringent border checks on the grounds that Croatia was now the guardian of the Schengen border, but wasn't doing enough to ensure security and restrict irregular migration. So he tends to shoot from the hip. He tends to, if you like, be the Flavor Flav of Croatian politics, the one who's the sort of, in some ways, the court jester, but also speaking what a lot of people are thinking. But fundamentally, when you look at who Zoran Milanovic is deep down, there are signs that he is still the person who was the leader of the centre-left Social Democrats, that he was the man who was a centre-left prime minister who presided, as Nina was saying, over Croatia entering the European Union in the first place. For example, during the presidential election campaign, while Dragan Primorac, who was supported by the governing HDZ, was saying that he would deport every irregular migrant and do everything he could to frustrate Serbia joining the European Union until they'd settled certain bilateral issues with Croatia. Mr. Milanovic was taking a much more conciliatory approach on both issues. So he knows how to work the public. Yes, he is a populist in that sense. He speaks the things that he knows the public are going to like to hear. But he also, when it comes down to it, when you looked at this campaign and what he was saying, there was a lot of what one might call the old Zoran Milanovic in there.
And so, Nina, what happens next?
Well, there's going to be another election on January the 12th, so that runoff, and as Guy was just saying before, the fact that Milanovic got within a whisker of getting 50% or more, obviously will focus minds, I think. Just also want to say that I do agree with you, Guy, when you're talking about how essentially Milanovic has been sort of branded by his political opponents as quote-unquote pro-Russian and anti-EU and all this. But actually, if you listen to the details of what he's been saying, it's a lot more nuanced than that. So, for instance, Milanovic has been saying that he doesn't believe that Croatian troops, in fact, he blocked Croatian troops from taking part in certain NATO initiatives to try and support troops in Ukraine and train them up. He wasn't in agreement with weaponry having been sent to Ukraine to help it defend itself. But when you listen to what he's actually saying, he's saying, well, look, hang on a second. The Americans aren't going to send their stuff. We're the ones in Europe who are going to pay the political price for this. Will Ukraine actually ever have the opportunity of really repelling Russia, getting rid of Russian troops from all of its territory? No. And so the point is he obviously, his straight talking does obviously resonate with a large percentage of the population. So obviously the question mark is whether or not in the runoff that's coming in about 12, 13 days' time, whether he's going to be able to capitalize on that. It's looking again, as per the polling, that he probably will manage to win a second term in office as a result of his success in this first round that put him, as I said, within a whisker of having accomplished what very few other people have accomplished in this generation since the Balkan Wars.
Nina, thank you. That's Nina dos Santos there. Thank you also to Guy Delaunay. This is The Globalist. It's 9:17 in Moscow, 7:17 here in London. Well, if Milanovic is Croatia's Trump, then Prime Minister Robert Fico fulfills the same role in Slovakia. Fico, an ally of Vladimir Putin, has been accused by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky of opening a second energy front against Kyiv on the orders of Moscow. At the same time, the Kremlin has suggested that Slovakia might be a suitable venue for peace talks, saying that the country has a neutral stance in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Well, I'm joined now by Mark Galeotti, a political analyst and the author of Putin's Wars, From Chechnya to Ukraine. Mark, thanks for coming on the show. What is the background to this energy row?
Well, essentially, it's the strange situation that despite the vicious war being fought in Ukraine, until the 1st of January 2025, Russian gas has still been flowing through pipelines on Ukrainian territory, from which Ukrainian coffers are enriched by transfer fees. Now, the Ukrainians have made it clear that on the 1st of January, that's going to end. And that will actually cut into one of the key supplies to Slovakia. And this has created this particularly sort of outspoken spat between Robert Fico, who is indeed, a little bit like Viktor Orban in Hungary, one of the European leaders who is not a puppet of Putin's, but nonetheless is more aligned towards Russia than their neighbours, who has threatened to actually, as a result, also cut off electricity supplies to Ukraine. And obviously the Ukrainians, who are very angry precisely at the fact that the Slovaks are responding in this way. So essentially, it's all about the gas supplies.
And I wonder what you can tell us about Fico's relationship with Putin and what's been said about Slovakia potentially hosting peace negotiations. It doesn't seem that the country is particularly neutral.
Well, we should keep this in context. Slovakia has, for example, provided of late not military, but certainly humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. And when Robert Fico went to Moscow recently, as he did, I mean, it was interesting that even the Russian press were very clear that Fico was there for pragmatic reasons. He was hoping to find some way of maintaining the supply of relatively cheap Russian gas rather than anything else. Yes, I mean, he is definitely out of step with the mainstream in Europe. But the idea, as Zelensky has suggested, that he's essentially some kind of Kremlin puppet is way off the norm. He is, I think, also like Orban, of the view that actually Russia may well win this war in some form or another, and therefore wants to make sure that, shall we say, he's on the right side of Moscow when and if that happens.
So if Slovakia is hugely important to Russia because of the gas deal, Azerbaijan is also a crucial partner in laundering Russian gas. I wonder if this has informed Putin's near apology of the downed Azerbaijani commercial airliner in Russian airspace. What has he said about this tragedy which killed 38 people on Christmas Day?
Yes, it's not an apology that he gave, but it's the closest that this president, notoriously for never apologizing, has ever come. You know, he said that he acknowledged and admitted and expressed his sadness that this tragedy happened in Russian airspace, which is, well short of actually admitting what is likely to be the case, which is that it was a Russian missile that accidentally shot this plane down. But the interesting point is, as you say, first of all, that Azerbaijan is vastly important to Russia now as a way of laundering gas. And ironically, most of the gas that flows through Azerbaijan and is then sort of rebadged as Azeri gas actually heads to Europe. But beyond that, it's also that the Azeri president, Ilham Aliyev, who is another sort of strong man, in some ways in quite a Putinist vein, is clearly not accepting this non-apology apology and is still pushing. And therefore, I think it shows just actually how fragile Putin's position is in what used to be called the near abroad, his neighboring countries. Once upon a time, there's no question of him having to apologize to a sort of leader of one of the sort of smaller neighboring states. But now he is.
And there is a historical parallel to this.
Well, there is. If one goes all the way back to 1983, you had the relatively newly appointed General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Yuri Andropov, ex-head of the KGB, a man whom Putin claims to regard as a role model, though I don't think he truly understands Andropov. Now, Andropov was no dove, but he had a keen awareness of the fact that the Soviet Union was basically spending itself into oblivion. He wanted to cut the defense budget, and he wanted to get out of this unwinnable war the Soviets had rolled into in Afghanistan. But, his early attempts to build some kind of détente all foundered when, at the end of that year, a Korean Airlines 007, sort of, again, probably because of problems with its navigation gear, strayed into Soviet airspace and 2 Soviet fighters shot it down. And at that time, Andropov did not step forward and say that this was a terrible tragedy or anything like that. The Soviet machine went into its usual cover-up mode. And frankly, that put pay to any thought of any kind of positive diplomatic engagement thereafter. And it's something that I know that Andropov himself actually regretted. And maybe, in a way, Putin is sort of learning the lessons, but not well enough and not quickly enough.
So if you fast forward to the KGB's modern equivalent, that's the FSB, Russia's Federal Security Service said on Saturday it had foiled a plot by Ukraine to kill a high-ranking Russian officer and a pro-Russian war blogger. What more do we know on that?
Well, very little. I mean, I have to be rather cynical here and say suspiciously little. I mean, the point of the matter is that the KGB has been on the back foot. Sorry, Freudian slip there. The FSB has been on the back foot for a long time. The Ukrainians have been launching this ruthless but also effective campaign of sabotage and assassination within Russia. And particularly we had recently the assassination of General Kirillov, head of the Russian Chemical Warfare and Radiological Service. And essentially from that point, suddenly the FSB is telling us, it seems every other day, that they've foiled some other plot. I mean, I think they're clearly looking to cover themselves rather than anything else. And so, look, at the moment, it may well be true But I can't help but also wonder if the FSB is just trying to look much more effective than it's been proven to be so far.
And Mark, finally, if we could just have a brief look at the reports of huge casualties amongst North Korean troops fighting for Moscow. So the US National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said a human wave of North Korean soldiers are being sent to their deaths in hopeless attacks by generals who see them as expendable. He estimates that Pyongyang suffered more than 1,000 killed or wounded in just the past week. Is there any clarity to this?
I mean, there's not, and we always have to have a certain amount of caution because clearly the West, the Americans, and indeed the Ukrainians have reasons to talk up both the level of casualties and also the degree to which the Russians are essentially using North Koreans as human ammunition. But I think what it also demonstrates is frankly, that war is changing. That, particularly, but not exclusively, the impact of the drone has really changed actually how soldiers fight. And if you look at the sort of battle-hardened Russian veterans in the Donbass, they operate in very small teams, largely dismounted. They make sure that they don't cluster so that they're not an easy target. There's no suggestion that the North Koreans have yet learned any of these lessons. They're fighting war, frankly, not just 10 years old, but sort of 50 years old style, and paying the price. But from the Russians' point of view, I mean, this is in some ways all a way of trying to soften up the Ukrainians. They really don't care if the North Koreans actually end up heading home in stretchers or in body bags, if it helps them pin and identify where the Ukrainian forces are. It's ruthless, but it may work.
Mark, thank you. That's Mark Galliotti there. Now, still to come on the programme, we'll look ahead to which art exhibitions we can enjoy seeing in European museums in 2025. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me down the line is Ruth Michelson, who's a journalist and a Middle East correspondent. Ruth, thanks for joining us. We've been discussing North Korean troops in Russia, a situation that worries South Korea greatly as they fear this is Pyongyang attempting to get the military battle ready. But this is not the only problem for Seoul, as we know. 2 presidents impeached in 2 weeks, and now knocking the political crisis off the front pages, the plane crash yesterday, which killed 179 people in one of the country's worst aviation disasters. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, so this is obviously has been leading headlines around the world. Absolutely awful video circulating, which this is in a rundown from the Associated Press, shows the plane skidding across the airstrip, overrunning the runway, crashing into a barrier at the airport. AP mentioning that the front landing gear apparently not deployed. Lots of discussion about the cause of the strike. AP also mentioning it will take months to determine this. Lots of discussion also about whether a bird struck the plane before landing. Apparently the plane gave a warning about this. The New York Times really describing awful scenes from this airport south of Seoul, talking about how 2 crew members were rescued alive from the tail of the burning plane, but talking about these groups of anxious and bereaved people, relatives of the people on board at Muan International Airport, which is in southwest South Korea. And, really just terrible descriptions from the New York Times about wails and screams filling the airport yesterday afternoon, the struggle to identify They said that only 65 of the dead could be identified through their fingerprints and other means. And of course, the mention of the context, as you said, that this is coming in the midst of a political crisis, and that the Deputy Prime Minister Choi Sang-mok has apparently gone to the scene to deal with what they said is the biggest challenge since he took office as acting president on Friday.
Let's move on now. Let's go to Sudan, where the government has rejected a UN-backed famine declaration. What's that all about?
So the famine declaration comes from a coalition of UN agencies that together are called something called the Integrated Food Phase Classification. So this is basically the global authority on famine. You mentioned that the military-backed government in Khartoum has said it is suspending cooperation with this group, accusing it of unreliable reports that undermine Sudan's sovereignty and dignity. But this is after essentially the world's highest authority on famine has said that Sudan is sliding into a widening famine crisis, that famine has spread to 5 areas affecting some 24.6 million people. That is about half the population, saying that they are in urgent need of food aid. The other thing is also that a body within the IFPCC has said basically that famine is the most extreme manifestation of human suffering. And so this really highlights some of the tragedy that is happening in Sudan at the moment, and also, you know, the fact that the military-backed government in Khartoum is suspending cooperation with the world's authority on famine is obviously a very, very concerning sign at this moment.
Finally, let's have a look at the headline in the Washington Post, which says, "Hot mess. Trudeau's turmoil draws Trump taunts. Canada's government is melting down at the worst possible moment." Strong words there. Tell us more.
Right. Well, we're back into, is Donald Trump joking or is he serious? So we've seen him joking recently about Canada becoming the 51st state, jokes about Justin Trudeau. The Washington Post pointing out that, yes, this is happening at possibly the worst time for Justin Trudeau, as one of the leading members of his cabinet has quit just weeks before Trump is back in office. This is Chrystia Freeland, considered one of Trudeau's loyalist and most powerful lieutenants, in the words of the Washington Post, the finance minister and deputy prime minister, and apparently who had been at odds with Trudeau over how to counter Trump. So hot mess for Trudeau. And now Trump is also threatening a rise in tariffs. So now there are Canadian officials back in Florida to have more meetings with Trump, basically after the last meeting was the one where he joked about Canada becoming the 51st state.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed. That's Ruth Michelson there. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Israeli forces carrying out a weeks-long offensive in northern Gaza ordered any residents remaining in Beit Hanun to leave the town yesterday, citing Palestinian militant rocket fire from the area. The military said the instructions to civilians to evacuate are meant to keep them out of harm's way, but Palestinian and United Nations officials say no place is safe in Gaza and that evacuations worsen the humanitarian conditions of the population. Mikhail Kavalashvili, a hardline critic of the West, was sworn in as president of Georgia on Sunday amid a political crisis after the government froze European Union application talks in a move that sparked major protests. Outgoing President Salome Zurabishvili, a pro-EU opponent of the ruling party, said in a defiant speech to supporters outside the presidential palace that she was leaving the residence, but that Kavashvili had no legitimacy as president, which is mostly a ceremonial position. And US billionaire Elon Musk drew criticism from German politicians from the government and opposition on Sunday for an opinion piece he wrote backing the right-wing Alternative for Germany, or AfD, which they deemed intrusive outside influence. The support of the AfD from Musk, who's set to serve US President-elect Donald Trump's administration as an outside advisor, comes as Germans are set to vote on February the 23rd after a coalition government led by Chancellor Olaf Scholz collapsed. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, Now, though 2025 is threatening to be a year beset with political, economic and climate challenges for all, for art lovers in Europe, there'll be much to celebrate. Here to guide us through some of the visual treats in store for us is Priska Amstutz, who's Director of Communications and Marketing at Kunsthaus Zurich, who joins us from our studio in the city. Priska, what will we look forward to seeing, particularly in Switzerland this year?
Yes, good morning. I will start my art year off in Engadin in St. Moritz, not in a museum but in a gallery. I've read an article about the exhibition of Jean-Michel Basquiat at the Gallery Hauser and Wirth in St. Moritz. I didn't know that Jean-Michel Basquiat had a special bond with Switzerland. It started in 1982 when he had his first show at Galerie Bruno Bischofberger in Zurich, and he returned, I think, 12 times to Switzerland, especially to St. Moritz, but also to Zurich and Appenzell. And he drew a lot of paintings, visualizing his bond with Switzerland and also putting it together with his relationship to New York. And this is shown at the Galerie Hauser and Wirth in St. Moritz until the end of March. So I think I'll go there at the beginning of the year and catch some sun on the way up there.
What about your own organisation, the Kunsthaus?
Yes, we also kick off the year with something to do with snow or ice. We will have Refik Anadol's show installation Glacier Dreams that was a gift gifted to us, and it will be on view from January 16th. And the artist has utilized over 100 million visuals from digital archives of glaciers, and it's an immersive installation. I have seen a video of a test installation outside of Zurich, and I think it will be a new highlight for our existing and new audiences. And then later in the year, I'm very happy we have several female artists shows at the Kunsthaus. First off, we have British artist Monse Chetwynd. We'll have an exhibition in the spring and a big garden sculpture named Zardos, and it's inspired by the 70s science fiction movie of the same name starring Sean Connery in a red bikini bottom. And as per the artist instructors, we all have to watch it to get into the mood of that. And then later in the year we have another artist, Suzanne Duchamp. She's the little-known sister of Marcel Duchamp. Exciting discovery. And at the end of the Ligia Clark, Brazilian artist.
Now, what are the highlights in Paris this year?
So one of the highlights for me is the Grand Palais. It has reopened after 3 years of renovation. My family is in Paris right now. I have urged them to visit Shiharu Shiota's show, The Soul Trembles. The Japanese artist is known for her very big sculptures with wool yarn. And I've read about that this is a trend in the art world. Apparently, the discovery of art focused on textile is having a big moment, and her sculptures are very moving to me. So I hope I will see that. It's on until March 19th, and on January there will be a Dolce & Gabbana exhibition also in the Grand Palais.
And finally, let's have a quick look at Amsterdam.
Yes, so there will be a big show. Anselm Kiefer is 80 next year, and there will be a lot of exhibitions throughout Europe. And our big one will start in Amsterdam and will later move on to London. It's called Where Have All the Flowers Gone? And it's like a dialogue between Anselm Kiefer's paintings next to Van Gogh's paintings that inspired him. And I really like these dialogue exhibitions where some traditional stuff gets shown next to modern paintings, and this is also a very good way to approach new generations and introduce them to old art and new art. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Priska, thank you very much indeed. That was Priska Amstutz, who's Director of Communications and Marketing at Kunsthaus Zurich, speaking to us from our studio in the city. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Tom Webb, Hassan Anderson and Desiree Bandley, and our studio manager, Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and I'll be back with The Briefing live at midday in London. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.